Okay, welcome to session C of session 26. I'm about to explain Keynes's explanation for the Depression and some aspects of Keynesianism, like aggregate demand and what animal spirits mean. But first, I think we need a little bit of background information on just the Great Depression. So, real quickly, let me give you some facts. First, okay, Great Depression. Most people say it began in 1929. Most people would say if you have to put a date of when it began, it would be the stock market crash. Sometime, I think it was October of 1929. So the stock market drops by a huge amount in one day. And then all of a sudden, GDP starts falling, unemployment falls. And that happened for the next 2 or so years, 3 or so. That was the worst part, but then things kind of lingered, and some people say that it was really kind of, the economy was kind of stagnant, and it never really recovered. Some people say until World War II. So the worst part of the recession was like kind of 1929 to 1931 or so, but then it lingered even after 1931. Okay, so I'm going to put the date 1929 somewhere in the late 1930s. Now I want you to know just a few facts, okay? I don't want you to have to memorize a lot, but this is something that educated people know, that when the Great Depression happened, the total fall in GDP, I'm talking about the real GDP after adjusting for inflation, was about 33%. This is a huge amount, okay? In contrast, so the greatest downturn of your lives would have been 2008, 2009. Some people call that the Great Recession. GDP only fell about 3% during that time. Okay, so the Great Depression, in some ways, by that measure, is 10 times worse than the Great Recession. Okay, um, two other facts: unemployment. Okay, unemployment was huge. Uh, it was about 25% at its peak during the Great Depression. Meanwhile, in the Great Recession, unemployment at the peak only got up something like 9%, maybe 9.5%. It was not near what it was in the Great Depression. Now, just for a little bit of context, I saw this is huge, the Great Depression. Now, what's going on in Venezuela right now? So as I speak, it's November 2020. Venezuela, the GDP there has dropped about double the amount of our Great Depression, something like 60%. So it is about double what we think the Great Depression's bad. Just try living in Venezuela in modern times. Okay, but regardless, the Great Depression is nothing. I mean, it was much, much bigger than what the Great Recession was in 2008. Okay, now, so I think probably most economists would agree that the biggest part, the biggest pain of the Great Depression happened in 1929, 1931, but it was exacerbated. And partly of that was because the United States uh, raised tariffs. Maybe worse, lots of the rest of the world, in retaliation for our raising tariffs, they raised theirs. And so all of a sudden, trade drastically decreased. And that happened kind of the early 1930s to the late 1930s. And the big act in Congress where we, the United States, increased tariffs was called, I call it the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Some people call it the Hawley Smoot. I want you to see, or it required you to see the video on YouTube, which is a scene from a classic movie. It's old. I mean, it was popular when I was in college. It's called Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So hopefully a lot of you have seen it. It's a great comedy. There's a famous scene in there. Most people just remember it, the scene of the boring professor, the boring teacher, where this guy drones on, and it's funny watching the kids going to sleep. One guy's drooling, but what a lot of people don't do when they watch the movie, they don't pay attention to what the teacher is actually saying. And it turns out that teacher is actually giving some good substantive economic content. The actor is named Ben Stein. So he's not just an actor, he's also an author, he's an economist. Um, at one point, he was a game show host. A lot of you have heard of Jimmy Kimmel. Turns out Jimmy Kimmel got his start on this show called Win Ben Stein's Money. Ben Stein, the guy you saw, was the game show host. Jimmy Kimmel was kind of his assistant on this, who would crack jokes and do other stuff. But um, the key thing is this Ben Stein, he's not just an actor, he's a very smart person. And the story is that on the set that day, they didn't actually write the dialogue for him. They said, well, it turns out Ben Stein was actually teaching law school at Pepperdine Law School nearby in Los Angeles. And they said, well, you're a professor, just give a boring lecture. He said, okay. So he talked about the Great Depression, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, the Laffer curve. But the key thing I want you to see is he talked about, okay, so I call it the Smoot-Hawley. He called it the Hawley Smoot. So Hawley and Smoot were two senators during the 1930s who introduced this bill, which drastically increased tariff rates. Okay, and this exacerbated the depression, and I wanted you to see that. Okay, so those are the key facts I wanted you to know about the Great Depression. Okay, that was part C. See in part D, well, I'll explain what Keynes had to say about the Great Depression.